So as we continue our discussion on all new, all different Marvel and DC Rebirth, something I want to point out here is in my video on Green Lanterns, I talked about a schedule that we were going to be using. And something I also want to point out here is that schedule is something we're going to be using here in a little bit. But for right now, we have a lot of catching up to do on both DC Rebirth and all new, all different Marvel, especially considering that Marvel Now 2.0 is right around the corner. And so what I'm going to do, and I'm going to watch the analytics to see how you guys respond to it, but what I'm going to do is basically bombard you guys with all new, all different Marvel and DC Rebirth stuff. Now, it's only going to be 2 videos a day. I'm not going to upload like 5 or 6 videos a day, but we're going to go through all the, or at least all the characters that I like, the teams that I like, the first story arcs for DC Rebirth, and we're going to do the same thing for Marvel Comics. And that way we can be prepped for when we get through, like, you know, the first story arc of the Champions, when we get into US Avengers, we get into the new Avengers that takes the place of all new, all different Avengers. When we start getting into that stuff, we'll basically kind of just be able to go forward as opposed to having to play catch up, you know, at that point in time. But what we're going to do here is we're going to pick up with all new, all different Amazing Spider-Man, Dead No More. Now, Dan Slott actually does a pretty interesting job with this story. This is kind of cool to me because a lot of the stories that I've read so far, you know, the story arcs, you know, Power Play, different things like that with all new, all different Marvel, the Spider-Man series hasn't resonated extremely well just because a lot of it felt like lead up to something else. It felt like prelude, and it was a lot of stuff happening, but nothing happening at the same time. And what this does is it sort of begins to turn things on their head in a couple different ways. The first is that it initially picks up with J. Jonah Jameson Sr. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, a lot of this stuff ties into Dan Slott's run, a little bit before his run, but the idea is that J. Jonah Jameson Sr. is starkly different from his son, J. Jonah Jameson Jr., who of course is the head honcho for the Daily Bugle and the one that writes all those articles about Spider-Man. Now, unlike his son, J. Jonah Jameson Sr. does not share a hatred for Spider-Man. He actually adores Spider-Man. But more so than that, he found himself in a relationship with Aunt May. And so this presented kind of a weird scenario for J. Jonah Jameson, but the fact remains that they deal with it the best they can. The issue here, and what Dan Slott doesn't really tell us, is that J. Jonah Jameson Sr. is suffering from some illness. We don't really know what it is, but it's basically progressed to the point where it's confining J. Jonah Jameson Sr. to a bed. And so the idea here, or at least what Dan Slott seems to be doing, is toying around with the notion that J. Jonah Jameson Sr. may die. Now, this in and of itself is not huge. What this actually does is set the stage for things that progress later on. But what we end up doing here is we basically pick up with Peter Parker while he's en route to a destination, and he's toying or looking at the idea of people who are cloning, people who are being cloned by a corporation called New You. Now, New You is something new by Dan Slott that he's created recently, and it centers around the Jackal, and we'll actually get to him here in a minute. But for Peter Parker, with the analysis of these organs that he's seeing, they're genetically identical to their originals. All the illnesses are basically eliminated, meaning that if somebody had, you know, an illness that would kill them, and you were to clone a heart that they need, or you were to clone a liver that they need, all of the genetic problems that they face would be eliminated in their entirety, you know. And so the idea here is basically Dan Slott kind of setting up the stage that cloning would most likely be the route that was used to save J. Jonah Jameson Sr. But again, he doesn't tell us that directly. He just kind of leads us on our own imagination to believe that that will most likely be the case. Now from here, we pick up with the Jackal and we start to get into this explanation. Now, something I want to point out is that I talked to Joel over at Cape Joel when I was trying to grab my bearings on this, because there were a few things that I had missed from previous story arcs that didn't quite fit in, or didn't quite, you know, that caused this to kind of not make sense to me. And one of the things we had talked about was the Jackal, and this is just kind of a general discussion between the two of us. But the Jackal, as he's presented here, Miles Warren is different from the Jackal that we saw, you know, before Secret Wars, in the sense that that version of Jackal was sadistic, was cruel, liked to inflict harm on people, but this version of Jackal isn't that way. And because everything else seems to be the same from before Secret Wars, and he's really the only major difference here, Joel hypothesized that there's only one of two circumstances going on. Either something happened in the life of Miles Warren that changed his entire outlook on life, or this is not the Jackal. This is not Miles Warren. Instead, this is, you know, Ben Reilly, or it's Kane. It's one of the clones from the original clone saga of the Spider-Man story. Now, again, I'm not swearing this is absolute, and I doubt Joel would swear to it as absolute, but I wouldn't be surprised if Joel had a video on this at some point in time. And so you should probably look up Cape Joel on YouTube. You'll find his link down in the description. Head over there and check it out, because it's actually a pretty cool theory that he had. But the fact remains here, they're basically emphasizing focus on Max Dillon on Electro. Now, this goes on before Secret Wars, and this is why I say not everything in all new, all different Marvel is all new and all different, but it doesn't mean that it's bad. Prior prior to Secret Wars, Electro had basically been part of the Superior Six, which is like a more updated version of the original Sinister Six under Dr. Octopus. And this tied in as part of Superior Spider-Man when Dr. Octopus took over the body of Peter Parker. And so Superior Six was just kind of capitalizing on the title Superior Spider-Man. But the fact remains here that Electro, despite his abilities, had always sort of been a street-level criminal. He had never really done anything global, anything massive, except for one time, and that was during Brian Michael Bendis's run of New Avengers, when Electro had been contracted to basically take out the power to the Raft to a superpower prison and allow all those supervillains to escape. What ended up happening though is that because Electro kind of fell back into the realm of being a street villain, nothing ever really came of it. And so during Superior Six, he was more or less placed under the control of Dr. Octopus, and once Superior Six came to an end and those various villains went their separate ways, Electro kind of became the butt of jokes. People made fun of him, people didn't take him seriously. And so the idea was for him to basically prove his worth by going back to the Raft and causing another blackout and freeing all those supervillains again. The issue here was that his powers ran into a state of instability, and what this did is it caused him to kill a woman that was in love with him named Francine Fry. Now, Francine Fry was kind of like a groupie, so to speak, for supervillains. She loved the idea of supervillains. She was both, emotionally and romantically attracted to them. And so for her, Max Dillon was a guy that she could latch onto. And while they did form as close of a relationship as, two villains can get, the fact remains that because his powers were unstable, he had accidentally killed her. Now, eventually this led into Peter Parker developing technology to basically take away the powers of supervillains as opposed to putting them in prisons. And the system that Peter Parker had developed was destroyed, but the first person to be exposed to it was Electro, which is the reason why in this story, or up to this point, Electro has had no powers. And so for those of you guys who are curious as to why he's been powerless, this is the reason why. Now, the entire goal of the Jackal here is to basically bring back the powers of Max Dillon, or at least it seems to be that way, to basically reinvigorate his powers. But more so than that, because Max Dillon is hesitant, because he doesn't really want to undergo this experiment, he's shown Francine Fry. Basically, Francine Fry was cloned and brought back. Now, Dan Slott shows the abilities of Jackal in a couple ways. Because Jackal's cloning people, we know by virtue of what we talked about a minute ago with Peter Parker, that any genetic impurities that they had have been wiped away, that any illnesses, any genetic imperfections that they've been completely eliminated. So Francine Fry is in peak 100% perfect health. The other half of this is that Francine Fry had a lot of tattoos, she had a lot of piercings, and those have been removed. And so it's almost like a purified version, so to speak, of her original self. Now, where Dan Slott chooses to go with this is something that I'm not entirely sure of. It may result in Peter Parker being completely depowered at some point in the future during Clone Conspiracy. We're just kind of spitballing with this, but the fact remains here that with Francine Fry being present, it's basically the kind of motivation that Jackal uses to get her to motivate, Electro to undergo the experiment. Now, with regards to Peter Parker in this story, this is one of the interesting scenarios because he's basically kind of like a background figure here. He's not a main character. He's not the main star of this. Instead, a lot of emphasis is put on Jackal, which I think is a great breakaway from what we've seen so far. Granted, Spider-Man's story should always center around Spider-Man, but it doesn't hurt to have a story arc here or there that takes him away from being the forefront and actually gives us perspectives from other people. And what happens in this is basically Dan Slott showing us that Spider-Man has a way of picking up who's been cloned and who hasn't. And what happens is one of his employees is basically injured in an experiment or injured in an incident at Parker Industries, and Peter Parker basically calls on his employees to activate New You, or at least to use the organs that have been harvested from New You, or the technology they use, to basically provide this employee with the organs he needs in order to continue living, because during the incident, his lungs, his heart, his liver had been damaged beyond repair. But what happens is when Peter Parker goes to see him, his spider sense kicks in, and Peter Parker realizes that even if he can't detect that this person's been cloned, that these organs have been brought in from somebody else. And so this guy is basically tricking out Spider-Man's spider sense. Now, Dan Slott doing this presents a couple funny situations. The first is that if Peter Parker were to encounter a regular civilian who's been used by the Jackal but has the organs of another villain, it's going to create a scenario whereby Peter Parker doesn't know that they're actually a bad guy. And we're going to see this experiment come to fruition, and we're going to see where this can lead to here in the next little bit. But the next thing that happens here is we actually eventually end up picking up with J. Jonah Jameson Jr. traveling back to his home and running into a woman named Marla. Now again, this is really just Dan Slott kind of thickening the plot here. You know, of course, Marla was a character who had a romantic interest with J. Jonah Jameson. The two of them had the potential to be happy, but the issue was that she had actually died, and so this really sent J. Jonah Jameson down the continued path of hating Spider-Man more so than he had before. But in any event, what we end up doing is we basically jump back to the Jackal. Of course, we have the Prowler, Hobie Brown, acting as Peter Parker while, or I guess acting as Spider-Man while Peter Parker is conducting his normal business. What ends up happening is Hobie basically changes out of his Peter Parker costume, out of his Spider-Man costume, and transitions into the costume of the Prowler. Now, the reason why he does this is for a couple reasons. The first is because Spider-Man is known as a superhero, and so if Spider-Man were to go about some nefarious acts, were to be experimenting around in different things, it could cause problems. More so than that, the Prowler is a street-level hero, meaning that no one really knows if he has any ties to anyone. No one really takes him seriously. And so if he were to spy on these villains, and if he were to be caught, they wouldn't come after Spider-Man's friends and family, they would come after Prowler's friends and family. But because he has no friends and family, there's really no one that they would go after. They would try to kill him, and if they failed, they would just kind of write it off. And so this is exactly what happens. The Prowler breaks into New U, and he begins poking around, trying to figure out where these organs came from, who's cloning them, so on and so forth, and he eventually stumbles across the lair of Jackal, and he witnesses both Jackal as well as the Lizard and a handful of others engaging in this process to attempt to restore Max Dillon's powers to him. The problem with this is that when the experiment occurs, Max Dillon does not get his electro powers back. Instead, the powers go into the suit, but they don't actually go into him, and so he could channel them through the suit, but they're not part of his physical body anymore. And so what happens here is that while he is trying to cope with this, while everybody's trying to figure out what's going on, suddenly his powers seem to activate by virtue of Francine, and she begins absorbing his powers to the point that she absorbs the life force of Max Dillon, killing him in the process. And so the result here is that she effectively becomes the new Electro. Francine Fry is now the new Electro, and Max Dillon seems to be dead for all intents and purposes. But while this incident takes place, we end up finding the Prowler is discovered by Lizard and by Jackal and, you know, these various people. Now, of course, Jackal says, do not kill him. He says, you know, keep him alive. The reason being because they could use him for their own purposes. The issue here is that Prowler is easily able to make his escape, and he's sought after by Electro, or by the new Electro, Francine Fry. But when she tracks him down, she actually kills him. Now again, Miles didn't want her to. Jackal wanted Hobie to stay alive, but because of the fact that he was killed, Miles basically brings him back, and this is where the caveat of the clones comes into play. What Miles says, or I guess what he does, is he presents Hobie Brown with the fact that he's been brought back to life, that he's been cloned and been revived, but the issue is that he's also given a pill, and he's told this pill has to be taken on a regular basis, indicating that this is how Jackal keeps the clones in check, that if they don't take the pill, they'll presumably die, and so because they want to live, they'll do whatever they need to do in order to stay alive. And so what we do here is we basically skip forward a bit, and we end up picking up with a backup feature. Now, this backup feature actually centers around the notion of how it is that Miles Warren, how the Jackal's able to cover all these things with the fact that he's also incurring the wrath of different enemies along the way. Now, again, this is kind of a prequel. This little segment we're going to talk about here is kind of a prequel to the events that we've talked about so far. But what happened is Jackal had basically approached Kingpin, and he told Kingpin that he would bring his wife Vanessa back if Kingpin was willing to fund his escapades, fund his desire to clone various people for his own personal reasons. But this was a funny thing because, again, myself and Joel were talking about this, and when the Kingpin meets his wife, where almost everybody else would be excited to see their loved ones come back from the dead, instead, the Kingpin breaks Vanessa's neck and says, "That's not my wife. You know, this is an abomination." Not only that, he says that because of the fact that Jackal would dare to clone Vanessa, that he's defiled her memory, and that Jackal has earned an enemy in the form of Kingpin. Now, what's also cool about this is that because the Jackal has been cloning people, he effectively has those clones at his disposal, and the result is that he calls in Rhino. Now, of course, with Rhino's superior strength, he's easily able to take on Kingpin, and of course, with the two of them fighting one another, we actually pick up with Spider-Man joining the fray. Now, where Spider-Man's able to hold them off, where Spider-Man's able to basically send Rhino running to remove him from the situation, the fact remains that Kingpin survived, and Kingpin makes his escape. But what he says is that his main focus here is Jackal. That Jackal created the most offensive instance of, you know, angering Kingpin by cloning his wife and defiling her memory, or I guess cloning his dead wife and defiling her memory. And so his goal is to basically track down Jackal. But if for whatever reason Kingpin dies in the process, he'll have Spider-Man do his bidding for him. Now, from here, this this is really just kind of Dan Slott tying up loose ends, you know, sort of giving us an instance of what direction things may go in, of the idea of this clone conspiracy story that's coming up. And so the thing about this segment of the story is kind of an epilogue. But again, this just basically deals with the idea that there are various people out there who are being cloned by the Jackal. Of course, we know that Gwen Stacy, the original Gwen Stacy, had been brought back to life by Jackal, and that was part of Marvel's Free Comic Book Day. For those of you guys who are curious, when Dead No More was originally announced, you'll probably have noticed, and we talked about it on the weekly poll, a lot of people were saying, well, now Gwen Stacy is going to come back to life. Gwen Stacy is going to be the new love interest of Peter Parker due to the fact that Mary Jane's kind of been ushered out and she's with Tony Stark. And this really seems to be the case. It looks like Dan Slott's kind of setting the stage for a return to the status quo before the Mary Jane Watson era, with Gwen Stacy being the love interest of Peter Parker. Now, whether he actually does this is something that we'll have to wait and see. But for right now, it's just kind of a tour of everything that's going on. We of course see May Parker, I guess Mae Jemison now, Aunt May, spending time with J. Jonah Jameson Sr., Peter Parker accepting the fact that some individuals may die, but by virtue of the knowledge that he has with regards to those cloned organs, that it's possible to bring them back to life, or at the very least, keep them alive. It kind of weighs on his mind, but we also see Peter Parker dealing with this idea that because a person was cloned, or because the life of his employee was saved, that he recognized him as a potential threat, even though he didn't seem to be a threat. And so as this begins to sort of wrap up, it looks as though J. Jonah Jameson Sr. may end up dying. But in the end, we don't really know what direction this will go in until we officially pick up with the Clone Saga story. But again, this is one of the reasons why, for those of you guys who are curious, this is one of the reasons why a lot of people are basically making the case that it seems as though Dan Slott is kind of retelling this original Clone Saga story, that Dan Slott is going back to the roots of Spider-Man clones, of Peter Parker clones, basically. And so again, as this story comes to an end, we basically come to the realization of the fact that J. Jonah Jameson Sr. has died. And so it seems as if the idea that if clones are going to start taking over, this will most likely be a byproduct of something that Peter Parker has done himself, that in his effort to grant his Aunt May the happiness she deserves, that he's going to go about and clone J. Jonah Jameson Sr., which will in turn lead to a whole plethora of problems in and of themselves. But with that being said, if you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, make sure you hit the sub button, become part of the Rob Corps, and leave a comment. Let me know what you guys think about this so far, because in truth, you know, again, I was a little hesitant about the Spider-Man stories up to this point, but I'm actually not really hesitant anymore. Dan Slott seems to be doing a pretty good job with with this particular story. I really like what he's doing so far. But again, you know, I'm just kind of throwing my thoughts out here. So let me know what you guys think, and I will catch you guys later. Peace.